Good day. Today is Saturday, 26th April 2025, the day after my discussion of the two proposals, the American proposal and the European proposal, which were presented to the Western powers and to the Ukrainians at the meetings in Paris and London over the course of last week. And the day after, the meeting in the Kremlin of Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, with President Putin of Russia and the Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, and Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's investment fund. I understand that Witkoff and Dmitriev had a separate meeting before the meeting with Putin. Now, as consistently happens, whenever Putin and Witkoff meet, the Kremlin does not provide a readout. They merely confirm that the meeting took place, and they also provide us with a photographic study. So we have pictures of Putin and Witkoff, and of course we've also had television film meeting in the Kremlin. It all looks very affable. Putin is smiling, Witkoff is smiling. Clearly the two men get on, but we're not told, the Kremlin does not tell us about the substance of the discussions. And Lavrov, in the interview with CBS, which I discussed in my program yesterday, a meeting which of course took place before the meeting between Witkoff and Witkoff and Putin in the Kremlin. Anyway, Lavrov explained why. He said that we, that is to say the Russians, are really polite people, and unlike some others, we never discuss in public what is being discussed in negotiations. Otherwise, negotiations are not serious. To ask for somebody's opinion regarding the substance of negotiations, go to Zelensky. He is happy to talk to anybody through media, even to President Trump. So that's what Lavrov said. The Russians don't disclose the details of negotiations whilst they're underway. They don't provide a full account of negotiations whilst they're underway. Now, that actually is interesting because what that confirms, in case nobody had figured it out already, is that the meeting between Witkoff and Putin is a negotiation. In other words, the Russians and the Americans are negotiating, and in a situation which I think is absolutely unique since perhaps the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. This negotiation in its entirety is being conducted by the two presidents, Trump and Putin, with each other, with Witkoff having the task of shuttling between them. We don't have the classical arrangement of negotiating teams headed by a chief negotiator, meeting in some neutral capital, going over every point, discussing things in detail with each other, coming to a consensus over time as to the way forward. It's nothing like that. It's nothing like the Paris negotiations that I've discussed many times, the Paris negotiations which led to the American pullout from Vietnam in the early 1970s. This is a two-way discussion between Putin and Trump. They've had, of course, I believe 3 telephone conversations, or maybe 2 telephone conversations, but the medium of their discussion is Witkoff, who basically goes from one to the other, bringing his ideas and opinions. Trump, no doubt, coming up with his ideas, bouncing them off Putin via Witkoff, and Putin doing the same with Trump. It is extremely unconventional, very unorthodox. It is not how superpower diplomacy is usually conducted. The closest to this is what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy, in effect, began a direct negotiation with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. They did so through two intermediaries, the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, who was, of course, the US Attorney General, and the Soviet ambassador to Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin. Those two met and established a back channel, but effectively, Khrushchev and Kennedy negotiated the entire resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis directly with each other, and it looks as if Trump and Putin are trying to do the same thing with respect to the Ukraine crisis as well. And this, of course, fits very well with Donald Trump's personality. He likes to think of himself as a master negotiator and deal maker, and he likes, obviously, to conduct negotiations, and he believes, with some cause, by the way, that he and Putin have a genuine respect for each other and an understanding of each other. Trump is far from wrong in assuming that. So he thinks that he is the best person to conduct the negotiations, and that these negotiations really cannot be delegated to other people. And as I said, he's using Witkoff as the intermediary to conduct the negotiations on his behalf. I suspect that there is another factor at play here as well, which was touched on in a program we did on the Duran, Glenn Deason, Professor Mearsheimer, and myself, which should not be overlooked, which is that Trump doesn't trust the US bureaucracy to conduct the negotiations. He has grave doubts about the State Department, the National Security Council, the staff of the National Security Council. He attempted in the past to conduct negotiations in a more conventional way. He probably remembers how the bureaucracy obstructed him and wrecked negotiations in the past. His attempt to conduct negotiations with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, for example. And he probably also remembers how the bureaucracy simply circumvented and blocked his clear instructions to pull US troops out of Syria, which is what he tried to do during his first term. So he doesn't trust the official people within his administration. He certainly doesn't trust the State Department. He doesn't trust the intelligence community either. The chief of Russian intelligence, or at least of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, Sergei Narishkin, has said that the Russians want a one-to-one meeting between Narishkin and the head of the CIA, John Radcliffe. But clearly, again, Trump does not see that as a satisfactory vehicle through which to conduct negotiations with the Russians. And the Russians obviously understand this, and they've agreed to this, and they're conducting negotiations with Trump in this way, in the absence of any other negotiations, formal negotiations being conducted in any other way at all. Anyway, enough of this. What came out of the meeting between Putin and Witkoff? Well, following on from what Lavrov said, the Russians, as I said, have not provided us with a readout because this is a negotiation, and they've not provided us with many details. But we have had a comment from one of the participants in the meeting, who is Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov. He was present with Putin when Putin met with Witkoff in the Kremlin. And this is what Ushakov said when he met with reporters directly after the meeting. The conversation lasted 3 hours and was constructive and quite useful. The conversation enabled Russia and the United States to additionally bring their positions closer, not only on Ukraine, but also a number of other topics. Well, that is quite interesting. It tells us that, as I said, the ideas have been worked around. It's absolutely clear that they're working from the American proposal, as I discussed in my program yesterday. The American proposal, unveiled next week and published by Reuters, it takes as its starting point the Kellogg plan, but it is clearly changing. The Kellogg plan is clearly evolving as a result of the discussions, the negotiations that have been taking place with the Russians. Dr. Jack Rasmus, who's written a fine article about this whole process, which I will touch on later in this program, he started to refer to the plan as Kellogg Plus, and I'm going to do so, though I ought to say that it might equally accurately be referred to as Kellogg Minus, because some ideas that were there previously in the original Kellogg proposal of April 2024, and which were clearly unacceptable to the Russians, have for the moment at least been withdrawn or deleted. But anyway, the Americans are slowly adapting their plan following their contacts with the Russians, and apparently that process continues. It looks as if, however, they discussed other things as well. They also clearly discussed the Iran negotiations. We're told, Ushakov has actually confirmed that amongst the other topics they discussed, certain international issues came up, and almost certainly the major one there was the negotiations between the United States and Iran, where, of course, Witkoff again is the chief negotiator. And it looks as if the Americans and the Russians, Witkoff, Dmitriev, and Putin, have also discussed further potential economic cooperation between Russia and the United States once, or perhaps I should say, if these negotiations come to fruition and there is some kind of a settlement between the Americans and the Russians, and perhaps between the Russians and Ukraine. Now, the other thing that was mentioned, and which Ushakov said Putin and Witkoff talked about, was the possibility of direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Now, this is interesting. If we go back to the American proposal, let's call it for convenience Kellogg Plus. We're told about the plan, the Kellogg Plus plan, under the provision ceasefire, talks about permanent ceasefire, both sides immediately engage in technical implementation negotiations. Now, notice that the words permanent ceasefire precede the words both sides immediately engage in technical implementation negotiations. But there is there the word immediately. In other words, my sense is that the technical implementation negotiations are intended to precede the ceasefire and that they're supposed to take place between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Now, Donald Trump, who's currently in Rome, has also spoken about the need for the Ukrainians and the Russians to meet. And he speaks about this meeting having to take place at the highest level. And that might imply a summit meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Now, whether Zelensky is prepared to meet with Putin at this time, that is another question. I get the impression that the answer is no. But put all that aside, there continues to be an obvious problem if the Ukrainians and the Russians are indeed intended to meet or at least engage in technical implementation discussions immediately. And that, of course, remains Zelensky's October 2022 decree, which prohibits direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. As I understand it, that decree prohibits those negotiations until President Putin steps down from office, ceases to be president of Russia, which is, of course, a fantastic idea and one which is not going to happen. So, how then do we have these negotiations take place? I assume that these are the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine that Ushakov was talking about, and which Witkoff and Putin would have discussed. And the purpose of those negotiations, clearly, is to agree how to set up and monitor and arrange a ceasefire. Ceasefire negotiations, by the way, can take a very, very long time. They may take weeks or months, and there's no guarantee in any conflict that they will be successful. Just saying. Witkoff presumably would act again as some kind of intermediary. Notice that the formula used in the American proposal is that both sides engage in technical implementation negotiations, which leaves open the possibility that they don't directly meet, that we have the same arrangement that we have with the Americans and the Iranians, whereby the two parties are in separate rooms, and then there is an intermediary who shuffles between the two, bringing proposals from one to the other. But anyway, how exactly is this discussion going to happen, and how is it going to be set up, and will the Russians agree to it? Well, I think the short answer is that the Russians probably would agree to it, because they lose nothing by doing so. From their point of view, and I think this is a critical thing to understand, they have not actually accepted Kellogg Plus. They have not said that Kellogg Plus is the way forward. What they do seem to be saying to the Americans is that Kellogg Plus does provide a useful framework for further discussion. However, the objective that the Russians have is Istanbul Plus, the demands that Putin set out when he spoke to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. Demands which, by the way, do include the transfer of the entire territory of the four regions to Russia. There is no statement from any Russian official which says that the Russians have given up on that objective. What the Russians have said is that if they can achieve their objective through negotiations rather than through fighting, then obviously they have no problem with that. So they can come along, discuss with the Ukrainians how to set up a ceasefire. They can say to the Ukrainians that the purpose of the ceasefire would be, the permanent ceasefire would be, as Putin said at the foreign ministry meeting in June 2024, to arrange for the eventual withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the remaining territory of the 4 regions. And the Russians can also discuss with the Ukrainians all the many other things that need to happen in order for there to be a ceasefire at all, such as an agreement by the Ukrainians for the proper monitoring and observation of the ceasefire, and also agreements which the Russians would probably insist upon, that Ukraine not receive weapons or intelligence from third parties, from the United States or the Western powers, whilst the ceasefire was in effect. I want to stress, I am not saying that the Ukrainians are going to agree to any of that. I am saying that in a negotiation, if a negotiation were to take place, the Russians would almost certainly make those demands. Now, the other thing to say about Kellogg Plus, which perhaps I didn't make fully clear yesterday, is that it doesn't contradict or make impossible the achievement of Istanbul Plus. The objectives that the Russians set out or that Putin set out when he spoke to the foreign ministry on the 14th of June. For example, it has been suggested to me by a number of people that the Kellogg Plus plan, the proposal presented by the Americans at the meetings in Paris and London, freezes the conflict along the current contact line. That is not what the text of this proposal actually says. In fact, the words contact line appear nowhere in this document. Just to say, what the proposal says, what the Kellogg Plus plan says, is that whilst the United States will recognize Russian control of Crimea and Lugansk in their entirety, the United States will recognize Russian control of whatever parts of Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Kherson region Russia controls. Now, that may be along the current line of contact if there is a permanent ceasefire in place now. But of course, if there isn't a permanent ceasefire in place now, if the permanent ceasefire is negotiated and agreed, as some expect, sometime in the summer, if we get there, then of course the current contact line might be significantly further west. As I will discuss later in this program, it looks as if the situation around Pokrovsk, for example, is now changing, and it is looking increasingly likely that there will be a Russian attempt to capture Pokrovsk over the next few weeks and months, and it could be that by the time the ceasefire is agreed, Pokrovsk will be under Russian control. In which case, according to this plan, the American plan, the Americans will recognize Russian control of Pokrovsk. So this distinction does need to be made. The two proposals, Istanbul Plus, the set of proposals Putin made in June last year, and the Kellogg plan, are not in direct conflict or contradiction with each other. The American proposal, could eventually bring us to the point where the other, Istanbul Plus, might be achieved. Let me stress again, I am not saying necessarily that that will happen, but one could see why the Russians are taking this proposal as a point of discussion, why they're prepared to engage with the Americans around it, why the negotiations between the Russians and the Americans are moving forward, and why the atmosphere of the talks between the Americans and the Russians is getting friendlier. Now, all of that now brings us to the other side, to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans, because if the Russians have not accepted Kellogg Plus, they haven't said, right, we accept it as it stands. We will do all the things immediately that have been suggested here. We will return the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to Ukrainian control on the proviso that the United States manages it. We will give the Ukrainians the Kinburn spit. We will stop the fighting on the existing contact line. Well, the Russians have not said that. They've said, like, we are prepared to work along with this, on this document, using this framework. That is not what the Ukrainians have done. The Ukrainians have rejected Kellogg Plus outright. They are saying that, as far as they're concerned, this entire plan, this entire framework to move forward this discussion is completely unacceptable. What they want to see is an unconditional ceasefire. They want that to happen immediately. They're not prepared to discuss territorial questions. They're not prepared to have the Americans recognize any part of Ukrainian territory as being under Russian control, whether de facto or de jure. They want the right to maintain their armed forces at their present level and even greater level, to continue to receive weapons from the West. They want European peacekeepers to be deployed in Ukraine. They want the right, in fact, they insist on the right to join NATO, and most specifically and importantly, they demand now, as a condition to enter into any discussions at all, a security guarantee from the United States itself, something which the United States is not prepared to agree to. So, as Zelensky made very clear in his speech on Tuesday, as both he and other Ukrainian officials have also made clear since then, where the Russians accept Kellogg Plus as a basis for future discussion and negotiation, the Ukrainians reject this framework, this entire framework, outright. So that now brings us to what is going to happen from this point on. Now, there are reports in the US media, in Washington Post, that after the collapse of the discussions in London on Wednesday, the Europeans tried to get the Ukrainians to accept that some surrender of territory to the Russians is now unavoidable, that Ukraine cannot continue to hold out indefinitely for the return of all of its territory, that the Russians are not going to agree to a ceasefire unless they have some guarantee, as they have repeatedly insisted, that that will lead to a certain outcome, which is Ukraine not joining NATO. That's conceded in Kellogg Plus, and to control of territory that the Russians consider theirs, also conceded in Kellogg Plus, with the United States itself recognizing that control. The Ukrainians are not prepared to accept either of those things. They refuse to discuss either of these things, NATO membership or territory, until there is an unconditional ceasefire. And of course, if there is a ceasefire, they will never agree to those things. They will continue to insist on Ukraine's right to regain all of its territory, and they will continue to insist on Ukraine's right to join NATO. So they have made that all very clear. The Europeans apparently tried to get them to agree to move on these points, but the Ukrainians show absolutely no willingness for the moment to do so. I say the Ukrainians. One Ukrainian politician, Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, has made some comments. He has said that he does believe that Ukraine must be prepared to cede territory. But Klitschko, who was an important figure in Ukrainian politics back in 2013 and 2014, has been eclipsed for some time. The Economist discussed recently, in a recent article, how as a result of Western support and the actions that he has himself taken, bringing prosecutions against his political opponents, locking some of those opponents up, driving others into exile, that kind of thing. There is really no political alternative to Zelensky in Ukraine at the moment. There is no sign that Zelensky is prepared to concede on any of this. The Washington Post says that the Europeans may have tried to get Zelensky to accept these realities, but he is resisting, and he won't even agree a ceasefire unless there are guarantees, and not just guarantees from the Europeans, but guarantees from the United States itself, as the proposal that the Ukrainians and the Europeans put forward makes absolutely clear. So we are, it seems to me, now at the point where the irresistible force, Donald Trump, meets the immovable obstacle. Because Donald Trump has come to understand that the Russians won't stop their advance westwards. They won't agree to a ceasefire until what they call the root causes are addressed. Trump has moved a significant way in that direction. He's conceded that NATO membership will not be granted to Ukraine, that Ukraine will not have membership of NATO. He's conceded that Ukraine will never recover Crimea. He concedes that Ukraine cannot recover territory that Russia controls in eastern Ukraine. But Zelensky refuses to do any of these things, and for the moment at least, he continues to play games with his October 2022 decree. Sometimes he makes out that this decree really is of no significance, that Ukraine can enter into negotiations, that he's prepared to negotiate with the Russians once a ceasefire is in place. Sometimes he says that he himself is not bound by the decree, so he can conduct direct negotiations with the Russians, but no one else can. What he never agrees to do is rescind the decree. And the Russians, obviously, call into question his readiness to conduct negotiations whilst he refuses to rescind the decree. And they also point out, and they are continuing to point out, that since there is a question mark over Zelensky's own legitimacy, his term expired in May last year. He's been continuing as president of Ukraine by renewing martial law and claiming that the renewal of martial law enables him to be president of Ukraine without elections beyond the expiry of his term. The Russians disagree with that. As I said, I'm not going to get into a discussion about whether the Russians are right or wrong about this, but the Russians repeatedly say that this contradicts the terms of Ukraine's own constitution, that Zelensky clinging on to power in this way casts a major question over his legitimacy, and they say that absolutely they are prepared to meet with Zelensky, they are prepared to speak and discuss things with him, but they have serious doubts about whether any document that Zelensky signs has legal authority in Ukraine, simply because of the uncertainties about Zelensky's own position. Now, I'm not going to get into, as I said, all of this discussion, but what I will simply say is this, again, that Zelensky himself doesn't seem to be keen on direct negotiations with the Russians, and the Russians, that they are prepared to enter into negotiations with the Ukrainians. I should make the point, by the way, that since the start of the special military operation, the Russians have never at any time said that they would not be prepared to enter into negotiations with the Americans, with the Ukrainians. But the Russians do have serious doubts about the sense and purpose of negotiating with Zelensky himself. And there are, of course, moments when Zelensky himself insists that he is the only person authorized or entitled to enter negotiations. So what happens? As I said, the Ukrainians have rejected this entire framework outright. The Russians have said that they're prepared to work with it. The Russians have said, they've always said, they're prepared to sit down and negotiate with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians play an incredibly complicated dance on this. Sometimes they say they will negotiate, other times they say they won't negotiate. They insist on a ceasefire before negotiations, something that the Russians don't seem, and in fact, clearly are not prepared to agree to. They make it very unclear whether negotiations even then would be authorized. They want a security guarantee before they have a ceasefire. It is all very complicated and very unclear what the outcome of all of this is going to be in terms of even agreeing a ceasefire. And the Ukrainians have already rejected the things that the Americans have already said about Russian control of Crimea and the four regions, and about NATO. The Ukrainians have already rejected it outright. So, what exactly happens now? The Ukrainians continue to be backed by the Europeans. The Europeans supposedly are trying to get the Americans to modify the proposal, Kellogg Plus, that Witkoff took with him when he met Putin. Well, at the moment, even as I'm speaking, we have an unedifying spectacle of various European leaders chasing Trump while he is in Rome to participate in the funeral of the late Pope, Pope Francis I. I say unedifying. It is true that world leaders do often meet at funerals of famous statespeople or great statespeople. It is also true that discussions and negotiations often take place during these funerals. After all, when world leaders come together and meet, inevitably they talk to each other, and inevitably when they talk to each other, those conversations will always have about them something of the quality of negotiations. But I've never seen it done quite in the way that is being done here. Trump is coming to Rome for 15 hours. He's going to be 15 hours in Rome, apparently only 15 hours. And yet we get Zelensky hurrying to Rome, begging to meet Trump. Unclear what they can talk about and discuss in the short time that they will have to speak to each other. The media is saying that there are other leaders who want to talk to Trump as well. Starmer, for example, no doubt Macron, no doubt all kinds of people. They all want, apparently, to meet with Trump. So one almost gets the sense of all kinds of people shuffling around, trying to catch up with Trump as he does whatever it is he's doing. Apparently, there's talk of gate crashing the US ambassador's residence where Trump will be staying and trying to meet with him there to discuss what exactly. I mean, what exactly is this intended to do? Are they going to try to get Trump to walk back on the proposal his envoy, Wickoff, has just taken to Moscow and presented to Putin? Or is there something else? Is there some attempt to go beyond that proposal in some way, to get a renewed commitment of American military aid or something of that kind? Whatever it is, how realistically is that going to be achieved over the course of the 20, 30 minutes, presumably, that Trump could afford to give to these leaders as they apparently seek meetings with him? There's the added complication that if we're talking about Zelensky, Trump now makes little secret that he doesn't like him anyway. And Zelensky, incidentally, quite obviously doesn't like Trump. And what is Starmer and Macron going to do if they meet Trump? In Starmer's case, he's not just talking about Ukraine. He's trying to negotiate with Trump some kind of tariff deal. Is he going to talk about that also with Trump when they meet? I mean, are they going to devote 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes to that discussion? It's an enormously complicated one. Or are they going to talk about Ukraine? And if so, what exactly are they going to talk about? Are they going to talk about European peacekeepers all over again? Is Starmer going to revisit the entire topic that he brought up during his visit to Washington back in February? The idea of an American backstop or security guarantee for the US, for the European forces that there's been some talk about sending to Ukraine. The whole thing, as I said, looks frankly cheap and ugly and generally desperate. That there is a sense that the Russians and the Americans are talking with each other. That with every meeting, the divergence, the gap between the American position and that of the Ukrainians and their European friends grows. And that they're scuttling around. The Europeans and the Ukrainians are scuttling after Trump, trying in some way to pull him back. Well, there has been an article in the London Times which says that Trump has no intention of being pulled back. Trump plan to let Russia keep Ukraine land set in stone, and that appears to be a quote. And we are told that President Trump's plan to let Russia keep occupied territory in Ukraine is set in stone, the Times has been told, as pressure builds on President Zelensky to accept a forced peace. Trump may meet Zelensky at Rome on Saturday on the margins of Pope Francis's funeral, but he believes that the Ukrainian leader, and then we have a quote. I'll be interested to know a quote from whom, by the way, because the Times doesn't say, that the Ukrainian leader really has no choice but to sign up to the proposal, according to a source close to Steve Witkoff. Could it be Witkoff himself? Just asking. The US President's special envoy. Trump is threatening to pull out of the peace process next week unless a deal is done. And that's another warning that apparently in private discussions, Trump is saying that unless Zelensky comes round, the United States will pull out of the entire deal next week. Perhaps, I'm guessing now, but perhaps on the 30th of April. Now, Trump has also been making some statements. He has said that he has no deadline, no actual deadline, but that he does want everything to be sorted out quickly. And I think that was some degree of misunderstanding of what Trump was saying here, because Trump's language is often rather vague. But I think what he meant was that if negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians get underway, if there is process towards a ceasefire, if there is serious process towards a ceasefire, and Trump went out of his way to say also that things are going smoothly, that the plan is mostly agreed and all of that. If that happens, then he's not going to impose any deadlines, because he'll be satisfied that the parties are moving in the right direction. But if the Ukrainians, if Zelensky maintain their current position, if they refuse to work within the framework of Witkoff's Kellogg Plus proposal, which means effectively, well, working within a framework that says that Ukraine won't be able to join NATO and won't be able to recover its territories, and will have to negotiate directly with the Russians without apparently the United States or the Europeans participating in those discussions, one-to-one, in other words. Well, in that case, if that does happen, then Trump obviously is not going to pull the plug on those discussions. He's not going to set any artificial timetables. He's going to let that play out and take its course. So what Trump appears to be insisting on is that Zelensky make a definite commitment this week to accept Kellogg Plus, the framework proposal that Zelensky rejected on Tuesday. Now, is that actually going to happen? Is it really the case that Zelensky believes that he has no choice, understands that he has no choice, We go on to read in the Times article that the United States believes that if Ukraine rejects the deal, the war would go on for months and possibly years, with Kiev reliant on Europe for funding and munitions. This is also from the same source. Witkoff, friend of Witkoff's, who knows? The United States, this is a direct quote, the US funding cut-off actually is going to have as much of an impact as the weapons cut-off this year, because Ukraine uses that money to buy more weapons from other allies, the source added. Asked if this was a take-it-or-leave-it moment for Zelensky, the source said the United States saw it as take it or take it. The Americans believe European public opinion will turn against the huge expenditure required to keep Ukraine in the war as the continent heads towards recession. And that's almost certainly true. So the point being made here is that the Americans feel that if Zelensky rejects this proposal, he is dooming Ukraine to a prolonged war in which he's going to be completely dependent on the Europeans, and the ability of the Europeans to sustain that support is going to waver, because the European public ultimately will turn against European leaders who support continued financial and military aid for Ukraine as conditions within the European economy deteriorate. I'm going to say straight away that I think that the reality is that if the United States pulls its aid from Ukraine, stops providing military and financial aid to Ukraine, then we're not looking at years of war ahead of us, possibly months of war, maybe as much as a further year of war if the Europeans pull out all the plugs, which is far from certain. But it's more likely that we're going to see a military collapse much sooner than that, and an economic collapse as well. So, in some respects, one can understand why the Americans think what they do. They're saying to themselves, without us, how can Ukraine survive? It will go on fighting for a while, but sooner or later, it's going to find itself facing the Russians by itself, at which point it won't survive. And so the Americans appear to be confident that Zelensky will break this week and come round to seeing things from their point of view, and will sign up to the American proposal, in which case, going back to the meeting between Witkoff and Putin, presumably some kind of meeting will be arranged between Russian and Ukrainian delegations to discuss how to move forward with the peace, a peace which the Russians, as far as the Russians are concerned, must have as its eventual outcome Istanbul plus the proposals, the terms outlined by Putin at his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June of last year. I'm not at all confident that Zelensky is going to do what the Americans expect him to do. He continues to get support from the Europeans. Some Europeans are already saying, again, that a bad peace is worse than a continuation of the war, which suggests to me that there is no unanimity of pressure on Zelensky to come round. And I don't think Zelensky anyway is particularly receptive to this kind of pressure. It's important to say that there have been many attempts over the course of this year to get Zelensky to make substantive concessions in order to get the peace process moving. But he has never done so. He has never compromised on anything, actually. Even the agreement for an unconditional ceasefire that was set out, that was purportedly agreed by the Ukrainian delegation in Jeddah back in March, was only agreed by the Ukrainians without him when he was not there. And if we go to the European-Ukrainian proposal, we can see that ultimately this has been walked back, because we're told that during the ceasefire there will be security guarantees for Ukraine, and these include security guarantees from the United States, which will be of an Article 5 nature, whilst there is no consensus amongst the allies on NATO membership. So I don't get the sense that Zelensky is ever someone who's in the mood to compromise. And I suspect also that he doesn't believe in the reality of the American position. Like other leaders before him, President Thieu in Vietnam, President Al-Ghani in Afghanistan, he probably believes that the American investment in Ukraine has been so great that if a final crisis ever develops, a situation where it looks as if Ukraine is going to collapse and be defeated, the United States will not be able to stand aside and will be obliged to come to the rescue. So I am not convinced that Zelensky is in fact going to come round in the way that the Americans expect that he will. If he does, then it will be a very interesting situation, because he might buy himself some more weeks, but I doubt that he will actually take really substantive steps to move forward to a ceasefire, at least not one that the Russians are prepared to work with. And the whole thing could spin on, and it could be months before we even get a ceasefire, before the terms of the ceasefire are agreed, if we even get to that point at all. And that brings me back to my underlying position, which is that despite this, despite the progress that has apparently been made with this whole process, despite the fact that Trump has put more realistic proposals to the Russians than I had expected that he would do, despite the fact that the Russians are more receptive to those proposals as a result of that, I still feel ultimately that it was a mistake for the United States, for Donald Trump personally, to get involved in all of this at all. Because progress depends on the unstable personality, I'm being kind now, of Vladimir Zelensky. And who would really count on that? Certainly not me. I would have thought that Zelensky would be a reason enough, the personality of Zelensky is reason enough to keep away from this whole mess. And the fact that the Europeans so strongly support Zelensky is another reason to keep away from this whole mess altogether. But anyway, this is the line that Donald Trump has taken. Now, if, as is more likely, or as I think is more likely, Zelensky resists all the pressure and says no, and continues to reject publicly the proposal that has been put in front of him. If he wheels and deals and says, yes, he'll speak to the Russians, not on the basis of this plan, and that he still wants an unconditional ceasefire and all of that, and that he wants to move everything back to his proposal, which is the European proposal, not the American proposal, then I think Trump should move forward and do that which he has apparently threatened to do, which is to call the whole thing off and walk away, maybe on the 30th of April, and leave Ukraine and the Europeans to sort it out for themselves. Whether he will do that remains to be seen. When somebody has invested a lot of time and energy in a project, and Trump has obviously invested a great deal of time and energy in trying to get this agreement to end the war together, the temptation to keep on doing it, to try to find ways around every obstacle, can be extremely strong. But I think on this occasion, Trump, as a businessman, should understand the sunk cost fallacy and should realize that really there isn't any way towards peace, that Zelensky, as his son, Donald Trump Jr., has pointed out, clearly isn't someone who is interested in peace, or at least not any peace on any realizable or achievable terms, nor are his European friends either, by the way. And he should say to himself at the end of this week, well, enough's enough. It's time for the United States to cut its losses and to bail out. I hope he does. I'm not sure he will. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, what all of this maneuvering has done over the last couple of days is that it has apparently killed, at least at the moment, Starmer's and Macron's coalition of the willing. There was never much enthusiasm for it. The only military units that were committed to the reassurance force that was going to be sent to Ukraine would apparently have come from Britain, France, Denmark, and the Baltic states. We're talking about a force that numbers perhaps 8,000 men in total, just saying. And that obviously would not have made a particular difference, any particular impression, given the scale of this conflict. And I get the sense that the British military was overwhelmingly hostile to the whole idea. I've noticed that in Parliament, the British Conservative Party, which is the official opposition, seems to be moving in the direction of opposing this idea also. And I suspect that the other opposition parties, at least Reform UK, will probably oppose this idea too. So, we've been told, there's been another article in the London Times saying that the whole idea of sending troops to Ukraine has now been dropped. The British are blaming the French. They're saying that this whole idea was really Macron's and the French's idea all along. The British were never that keen on it or keen with it. That, by the way, is nonsense. I mean, Starmer has clearly been advocating for this plan and lobbying for it. Heavens knows, he went to Washington and lobbied for it with Donald Trump himself, pleading with Trump to give this reassurance force a security guarantee. For Starmer to turn around now and to say that he was always skeptical about the whole project and that it wasn't even his plan is ridiculous. It is nonsense. It is another example of Starmer reversing himself and pretending that he was always against the very thing that he once supported. Just saying. But anyway, for the moment at least, the British are saying this isn't going to work. We're out. It's all the fault of the French. It was the French who came up with this. That's, by the way, a standard trope in Britain. Blame the French whenever anything goes wrong. I'm not going to get into the details of that meme. But anyway, it's all the fault of the French. We should never have gone with this at all. Let's forget about sending troops to Ukraine, military contingents. Let's instead send trainers to Ukraine. But let's nonetheless go ahead and have a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine as well. Now, trainers have been sent to Ukraine in abundance. Many of them, of course, are not trainers. They do other things whilst they are in Ukraine. We did a program on the Duran some weeks ago, Alex Christopher and I, and our guest, and I forget which guest it was, said that right at the beginning, in February 2022, when the Russians sought to seize Gostomel Airport near Kiev, which, by the way, it ought to be said, they did eventually seize. But when they were attempting to seize Gostomel Airport in the first couple of days of the Russian advance into Ukraine, they came up against British SAS troops. There was exchanges of fire between them and the Russians. I don't know the details of this, and I'm not going to speculate about it. But anyway, the point is, many of these so-called trainers actually have a much more active role than simply trainers doing training. But anyway, more of the same. We're going to send all of these trainers to Ukraine. The training they do has not made any difference to the quality of the Ukrainian forces over the course of the conflict. The Ukrainians, in fact, routinely grumble about the inadequacy of the training that they are given. And as for the idea of a no-fly zone patrolled by the British and French air forces over Western Ukraine, the Russians have again categorically ruled that out. It isn't going to happen. The point about the collapse of this coalition of the willing is that virtually everybody now in Europe can see clearly that the Americans are one way or the other bailing out. The Americans are not going to provide security guarantees. They're not going to put troops on the ground. They're not going to provide the kind of support that many people in Europe were hoping for. And in light of that, they're not prepared, the Europeans are not prepared to put their forces at risk by committing themselves in that kind of way. And it goes beyond that, because despite this show of European unity that we've seen over the last couple of days, the reality is that European unity is disintegrating. For some time now, Italy has been quietly adjusting its positions and changing sides. Giorgia Meloni, when she first became Prime Minister of Italy, was an outspoken supporter of Ukraine, a strong critic of Russia, somebody who sent military equipment to Ukraine. She has, in the face of the realities, begun to shift her position and Italy's position. So Italy apparently no longer sends military equipment to Ukraine in any quantity. Italy has spoken against the idea of deploying a reassurance force in Ukraine. Meloni has made it absolutely clear that if such a force is ever created and deployed in Ukraine, Italy will not be part of it. Meloni has had a very friendly meeting with Trump, I believe in Mar-a-Lago. She's clearly signaling that she is on Trump's side in this quarrel. And I notice that in all of the criticism that there has been of the American proposal that was published this week, criticism that you find across the European media and from European governments, Italy has been silent. It has not joined in that criticism. And of course, if Italy's shifting position, and Italy is an important power, it is the third biggest economy in Europe, and by the way, after Germany, it has Europe's second biggest industrial base. If Italy is shifting position, then you can be certain that other countries are shifting as well. Obviously, Orban and Fico have made their position absolutely crystal clear. They do not support the European side. They're absolutely on side with Trump and what he's trying to do. They want an end to the war as quickly as possible, and they accept that that will have to be, at least in part, on Russian terms. And what Fico and Orban think, which I suspect now is not that different from what Meloni herself thinks, I suspect is going to be thought quietly by various others. Lavrov, in a very interesting comment, says that Russia has been receiving whispers from France that France now wants to re-engage with Russia in some way. Now, this is all very confusing because Macron remains incredibly rude and aggressive in his public comments about Russia. He doesn't seem to have any ability to change course. But I wonder whether these whispers that Lavrov is talking about come from some people other than Macron. Just saying. Anyway, if there is an American decision to pull out, and if the United States then moves forward and starts ending its own sanctions, then at some point the Europeans will follow suit, because too many countries in Europe will break ranks and will insist that that happens. So, anyway, there we are. This is the situation at the moment. The Europeans, Zelensky, chasing Trump around Rome, trying to meet with him. I mean, if it wasn't also tragic, it would actually be funny. It's the kind of situation where I feel that my colleague and friend Alex Christophorou's comedic qualities really come into their own. I mean, the whole business of running after Trump in order to meet with him to discuss what exactly seems so weird, at least to me. And so, as I said, ugly, and by the way, disrespectful to the late Pope, whose funeral they're all supposed to be attending. But anyway, there we are. But anyway, we'll see what happens. This week is going to be crucial. Trump has also spoken, by the way, about how everything is, despite all the progress that is being made, he acknowledges that it is fragile, which it obviously is. An awful lot now depends on Zelensky. Somebody who is unpredictable, to say the least. Somebody who absolutely cannot be counted upon to make any kind of decision, but whose sincerity in seeking peace, I can't believe anybody who knows this conflict well takes seriously by now. So anyway, we will see what Zelensky does. My own sense is that he will remain as intransigent and as outspoken and as impossible as always And then it will be up to Trump at the end of this week, maybe on the 30th of April, maybe on the 1st of May, to make the final decision. Does the United States go on, waste more time trying to negotiate and find a way forward, get itself tied up even further into more and more knots which need to be untangled? Or does it finally walk away and make up in some way with Russia? Well, that's up to Donald Trump, and we shall see. Anyway, the war in the meantime goes on, and I'm not, again, going to go into a detailed account of the war at this point. What I would say is that there have been some important developments over the last couple of hours. The Russians have now created another group of forces in the north. This is Group of Forces Kursk, which is clearly separate from Group of Forces North. So Group of Forces North has been divided, and there's a new group of forces which is been hived off, Group of Forces North. That suggests that these two groups of forces are going to be reinforced, and that one Group of Forces North will probably now focus on Kharkiv, on linking up with Russian forces west of the Oskol River, now that the battle for Volchansk is essentially over. Whereas the other group of forces, Kursk, which apparently has driven the Ukrainians out of Gornal, the village of Gornal. There are apparently one or two buildings that the Ukrainians still control. But Group of Forces Kursk presumably is going to focus now on Sumy region and perhaps Chernigov region as well. An area, a region which, to repeat again, is not that many kilometers by main road from the capital of Ukraine, Kiev itself. If the regional capital, Sumy, is captured by the Russians, were captured by the Russians, then there is a main road that leads directly from Sumy to Kiev, which is, I believe, just 70 kilometers away. Just saying. Anyway, that's in the north. There's considerable reports of very heavy fighting in the area on the southern part of the Zherebets-Oskol rivers. There's now heavy fighting to control the village of Troitske, west of Siversk. It seems that the Russians mostly captured that village before Easter, but the Ukrainians, this is what I've heard, used the Easter ceasefire to recapture it. So the Russians have had to start there all over again, but it does seem as if they're in the process of doing so. But perhaps more importantly, it looks as if the Russians are in the process of capturing certain key villages north of the town of Liman. And it's assumed that if the Russians do capture these places, then the Russians will be launching an attack on Liman to the south. And it's been pointed out that this is the same route that was followed first by the Russians in May 2022, and then by the Ukrainians in October 2022, when they each captured Liman earlier in the war. So it looks as if a battle for Liman is about to start. Perhaps the most dramatic news relates to Pokrovsk, where the Russians apparently are continuing their advance to the northeast of Pokrovsk, ultimately maybe to Novoekonomichnye. As I said, they seem to be in the process of capturing the village of Miroljubivka. But perhaps an even more dramatic development is that, having apparently now fully consolidated control of Kotlino, the Russians west of Pokrovsk are now advancing northwest towards a village called Sergeyevka. Now, Sergeyevka is located just south of the E50 road, which is one of the remaining supply roads, the two remaining supply roads that the Ukrainians use to keep their garrison in Pokrovsk supplied. The southern road has already been cut by the Russians. The northern road, this is the northern road. If Sergeyevka is captured, presumably this other road would become unusable. If the Russians capture Novoekonomichny and they also capture Sergeyevka, west of Pokrovsk, then it looks to me as if the Russians will have in effect cut the major supply roads to Pokrovsk. They might not be in physical control of the roads themselves, but they will certainly be able to establish drone control over the roads, and in that case, supply situation for the Pokrovsk garrison will become catastrophic. And I suspect that in that case, Pokrovsk will fall, and fall quite quickly. There would be other roads which the Ukrainians could use, but they are again small country roads, not all of them paved. And given that apparently this is mostly open country, there are few tree lines, few villages as well in this area. We are moving away from the heavily built up areas of Donbass. There's little cover if these smaller roads are used. Little cover and protection from the Russian drones. We could see a collapse in Pokrovsk, not very different from the collapse we saw in the autumn in Selidovo and before then in Ugleda. Just saying. So anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. Of course, if the American aid completely ends, then the situation, which is already bad, is going to become catastrophic. But for the moment, at least, the war goes on. There are other reports of other Russian advances. The Russians are saying that Ukrainian defenses in southwest Donbass around an important town called Bogatyr has collapsed, that the Ukrainians are retreating from those positions and maybe from the town itself. But all of this is something I will return to in other programs. Now, in the meantime, as all of this has been going on, with respect to Ukraine, there is a major flare-up, a confrontation developing between India and Pakistan, exchanges of fire, a major crisis. It is not clear to me yet where this is going precisely. Tension between Pakistan and India never goes away for any particular length of time. It always resumes at some point in some form. It's a very dangerous situation, given that these are both nuclear powers, and at the same time, a final reconciliation and rapprochement between these two countries looks all but impossible. I am not up to speed with all the details of this latest crisis. I'll be reviewing it more thoroughly over the next couple of days, and I will return to it no doubt later, and we will no doubt be doing a program about it specifically on the Duran itself. Meanwhile, there is considerable uncertainty about what exactly is going on over the tariff question. President Trump has given the impression that he's had some discussions with President Xi Jinping of China. The Chinese deny this. President Trump has given the impression that there are negotiations underway between China and the United States on the tariff question. The Chinese deny that too. There was a report that appeared yesterday that a Chinese trade delegation has been seen entering the Treasury Department. I am not sure about this report. I've seen some of the pictures. I'm not sure that this means quite what people say it means. But I do expect at some point over the next few weeks a de-escalation of the crisis, the tariff crisis between China and the United States to take place, with substantive trade negotiations probably following. I would quickly say that up to now, the plan, if it was a plan to isolate China, appears to be failing. I have not yet heard of a single country which is a trading partner of China's that has agreed to reduce or sever trade relations with China because the United States wants it to. So anyway, there we are. This is where I'm going to end the program today. As I said, an absurd situation playing out in Rome. As I said, Zelensky running after Trump, the Europeans running after Zelensky and Trump, everybody trying to speak to Trump. Nobody apparently, as far as I can see, having any clear idea what exactly it is they want to say. Trump neither refusing so far nor agreeing a meeting, and all of them pretending to be there to mourn the Pope. As I said, I find it really weird. But anyway, there it is. And in the meantime, the Russians continuing to advance and probably sensing that the Americans are slowly, gradually, ever so gradually, shifting in their direction. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Until then, have a very good day. Let me remind you, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget also to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.